If the world is split into commissars and dissidents in different places, and what is a commissar will be called a dissident eventually, and our present dissidents may be heroes, what is the possibility of having any real change on a global scale? I was interested in the doctrine that the professor who introduced you said, but the reflective person being one focus and the global truth being another one. But if your effect on global truth is volatile and ever-changing.
No, it's not. It's ever-changing, but if you think about it, it's changing for the better. Mm-hmm. And it's not changing for the better by any gifts from the gods.
Do you think focusing on personal change is the way to go?
Well, you know, that's a decision you have to make, but I don't think so, no. But the fact of the matter is, if you look over time, today, first of all, the Soviet system of tyranny did collapse. Looking at ourselves, the counterpart of Eugene Debs would not be thrown into jail today, nor would Bertrand Russell be thrown into jail today, nor would Emma Goldman be kicked out of the country today, nor would labor be crushed in anything like the fashion it was crushed in the 1920s. Now, that's all unimaginable today. Things aren't great, and there's plenty of things wrong, but there's a lot that's much better. I mean, just think about today's problems. You know, like say today, there's a problem of trying to maintain. This is a value judgment. Maybe you have different values, but I'll speak from my own. There's a problem of trying to sustain and extend and strengthen the very meager healthcare system that we have. There was no such problem in the 1960s because we didn't have the system. Okay, so now it's a problem of trying to defend what in fact came out of the ferment of the 60s. What came out of the ferment of the 60s was there was a lot of pressure, which ended up in some degree of legislation. There was a thing called the war on poverty, which is, like most of these terms, kind of a joke. It was maybe like a small skirmish against poverty. It went on for about 2 years, and then it started declining. Like AFDC, the main welfare program, which was just killed, that has been declining steadily since 1970. From 1970 to 1990, it went down by about 50%. That was part of the general attack on women and families and children and so on that really picked up steam, and they, mainly under the Reagan administration, but by the late 70s. Actually, Nixon was our last liberal president, if you want to tell the truth, the last New Dealer, I mean. Or take, say, Social Security. Okay, now there's a problem of defending Social Security. In the 1930s, there was no such problem. There was no such system. The freedom of, take, say, freedom of speech. That's one dimension on which the United States does rank very high. The United States does, freedom of speech is protected to a degree that I think has no counterpart in the world. At least I don't know of any. But remember how recent that is. Until the 1960s, freedom of speech literally didn't exist in the United States. Until the 1960s, you could be jailed for seditious libel. That's the keystone of, that's the hallmark of a free society. Seditious libel means assaulting the state by words. Okay? That was a crime in the United States, as it is in England today, for example, and in most of the world. It was a crime in the United States until the 1960s. It was finally struck down by the Supreme Court in the course of the Civil Rights Movement, and in fact as a reaction to activism in the Civil Rights Movement. Well, okay, that was a landmark, and there are others. But all of this is progress, and it shows that it's not true that things can't change. In fact, we know that they can change. They have changed. They've changed dramatically. Okay, maybe, but if you want to say, have we reached kind of heaven? No. Plenty of problems, but to say that nothing can be changed is just to ignore history. I mean, we don't have feudalism, we don't have slavery, there's a degree of women's rights, there's a degree of respect for other cultures, there are protections for fundamental human rights which didn't exist not long ago. Well, it wasn't given to anybody as a gift. It was won by struggle and by some people who joined the struggle and became voices for the voiceless, which anybody can do. They weren't preaching to them, incidentally. They were joining them.
Can you cast a pattern or a blueprint for a mass movement which could be politically effective?
All the ones I just mentioned were politically effective. What I've just said is that they are politically effective. That's why we don't live under feudalism and slavery, and we don't have counterpart of Eugene Debs being thrown into jail, and we don't have hundreds of workers murdered by the state security forces because they're involved in strikes, as happened early in this century, and on and on and on. I mean, look, we had essentially slave labor in this century up until the 1930s. If you look at the South, you know, after slavery was officially eliminated, and after, you know, Reconstruction was beaten back, there was a slave labor system in the prisons. Prison labor in the South was an enormous system, blacks, of course, and it's the source of the big industrial revolution that took place in the South in the late 19th century, early 20th century, northern Alabama, Georgia, Tennessee, and that region, where there was a big industrial revival, mostly on the basis of with slave labor in prisons, in other words, which the employers described as reliable and productive, not like those workers in eastern Pennsylvania and Ohio who were rambunctious and striking and that kind of thing. And these guys didn't need any benefits and so on and so forth. That's pretty recent, you know. In Mississippi, it went on until the Second World War. Actually, since things are cyclic, remember, it's now being reinstituted. So we are now reinstituting a system of slave labor in prisons, which is nowhere near the scale of what it was in the early part of this century, and again is mostly black, and the drug war is mostly used as a pretext to try to drive them into that. And it's being reconstructed, and in fact it's very valuable for American corporations. Same reason, you know, it's cheap labor, controllable, can't strike, no benefits. It's got all the things that economists tell you are good. It's a flexible labor force, meaning it's a flexible labor market. If you don't need them today, stick them in the cell, the state will pay for them. If you do need them today, pull them out of the cell and they'll work without making any fuss about benefits and things. So it's a perfect labor market. And it's being rebuilt, but nothing like the scale on which it was. Well, these are all victories that were achieved. They're not permanent victories, and sometimes things go backwards, as now. But they are achieved by popular movements, by exactly these popular movements fighting to defend the fundamental human rights, the ones who the Archbishop was talking about. And in El Salvador, they won some victories too. I mean, they suffered a very brutal time, but they won some victories. Pardon? No, not at all. I mean, there are plenty of people who didn't end, I mean, there are plenty of people who remained alive. You know, I mentioned the ones who got murdered, right? I mean, it's true that dissidents aren't welcome, but the way in which the reaction to them depends on the nature of the society. In our satellites, that's true. They tended to get their brains blown out or be cut up to pieces with machetes and so on. Other societies are somewhat different. At home, it's changed. It used to be much harsher than it is. I mean, for us to talk about repression is a joke, to tell you the truth. I mean, dissident intellectuals in the United States are so privileged as compared with just about anybody in the world, so protected, that for them even to mention the word repression in regard to themselves is a sick joke. I mean, maybe the worst that'll happen is somebody will yell at you or you won't get a job. Their worst fates.
Yesterday you said that...
Incidentally, if I can mention, I have to qualify that. That's true of dissident intellectuals in the United States who are from the more privileged and wealthy sectors. It wasn't true of Fred Hampton, for example. Then you can still get murdered.